Norway chess has begun. This is the first top level tournament played over the board since I can't remember when. So it's great that the players are back playing proper chess. I'm going to be looking at the first round game between Tari, 21-year-old Norwegian, great hope, and Fabiano Caruana, world number 2, playing with the black pieces. Found this a really fascinating game, actually. And if you want a lesson in why the Sicilian defence is, in my opinion, a very positional opening, then look no further than this game. This was, in many ways, a model game. A big shout out to the Romo Chess Academy in Los Angeles, California. Your boy done good. Take a look at this. So Tari with the white pieces. It's a Taimanov from Caruana, so he's obviously prepared to, unbalance the game playing a Sicilian. Tari is a strong grandmaster. He's rated over 2600. But of course not in Caruana's league, so Caruana really wants to try and play for a win here. G3 from Tari, and this is, I think, a very good line for white. It's very solid. The bishop is going to come to G2, where it solidly protects that E4 pawn here. A6. Now, the line that the players follow here is a very old line. In fact, those of you who followed my series on Bobby Fischer in the candidates tournaments way back in 1970, 1971 will recognize this position from one of the Fischer-Taimanov games. So black hasn't castled yet, but black has managed to get that bishop out to c5. But there is potentially a problem with that pawn on d6. So, whoops, that wasn't the right move. Bishop e3 played. So this is kind of a starting point of this whole variation. Now, Taimanov played bishop g4 against Fischer. Bishop e6 is also reasonable. Bishop b4 played recently by Hari Krishna. King e7 also possible. But Caruana took on e3, and this is a very unusual move. Never played at the top level before. If white recaptures with the queen, then black is very solid in the center. In this kind of position, this backward d pawn means nothing. In fact, it's the play down the c file which is often very important here. But it was always thought that the problem with taking on e3 was f takes e3. And how exactly does black defend that pawn on d6? Because of course if the king steps forward, that's very unfortunate. Rook takes and then a big knight fork on d5. So if we come back here, so black has to give up that pawn. And well, Caruana was playing these moves very quickly, and he revealed after the game that this pawn sacrifice was actually suggested by his second, Rustam Kazimjanov, the night before this game. And it leads to one of these typical Sicilian defense endgames where black has pressure on the c-files. This is a fascinating strategic game. So Tari was obviously surprised. He spent a little bit of time here, played a4. h5, that could be interesting. You never know if that pawn is going to advance a step forward here. So h3, so if h4 then g4. And now Caruana took and played knight d7, and that prevents the rook swinging across to b6 there. And now h4. And timing is actually very important here, because if white has enough time to bring that king to h2 and play bishop h3 to exchange off that bishop, then white is doing pretty well. But actually, here's the problem. King e7. Now Tari brings his rook back to d2, and that rather falls back, well, we're about to see, falls into a rather passive position. Maybe he should have gone back to d1. Things after rook d2, and he thought for almost 20 minutes over this decision, is that after knight b6, you can see black starts to get this typical Sicilian pressure. The knight comes to c4. Now Tari had obviously foreseen this and prepared a response, but there are problems with this. Let's have a look. Knight d5 check. Bishop takes, pawn takes, knight c4. So that knight comes in, and rook e2 to defend one of those pawns. Now, of course, if that pawn is taken here, then that's a problem. Then rook b1, and the rook is going to take on b7. So the knight dropped back, and this is the kind of position that Caruana was obviously hoping for in this whole variation. That knight, what a beautiful blockader it is on d6. And also black has a 4-3 queenside majority, kingside majority. White's pawns on the queen side are going to be blockaded. So you can see on the dart squares, black is doing very well. Now, rook activates, that ties the white rook down to the pawn on a4, also pressure here. And of course, if b3, then that rook is just going to step forward to c3. So white, you can see white is tied down to the defense of those pawns. f6, rook up to e3, rook hc8. So that prevents white from playing b3 and c4. And white is just a bit passive here. I mean, if black just sat there, it would be very difficult for white to make any progress. g5, but actually now Caruana really starts to take the initiative in the position. This is actually quite a critical moment in the game where white has to decide, do you sit there or do you try and shake things up? Well, Tari basically decided to sit there and try to hold the position. But with hindsight, that turns out to be a mistake. I think it's best to exchange on g5 and bring the king over to d3, and actually sometimes threaten to actually open this front on the king side, or maybe even get just a bit of pressure there, which would at least divert black's forces. Even though black has created a passed pawn there, I feel that white should have enough play there. But instead Tari played bishop f3. Caruana closed it with g4. So Tari has basically just closed it, held the position. But now this is very difficult. Black has two pawn breaks here. One is b5, as you can see I've marked on the board, and that could set up pressure on the b file. And the other break is, and so Tari drops the bishop back to f1 to cover that, and the other break is f5. And this means that Caruana is now about to recover his sacrificed pawn, and also he's got his kingside pawn majority rolling. So let's just see how that happened. So a rook exchange, and here we go, e4. So you can see that Caruana is going to pick up that pawn. Bishop c2 might have been a better move here. So it's more difficult for black to get things rolling, but still, I think it's already a difficult position. Knight takes f5. So now material it's even, but we have this typical Sicilian situation where black has managed to create this passed e-pawn, and it's this pawn that gives black tremendous central control. and means that white is just going to be forced back, and basically that passed pawn, that is the winner for black. That is going to decide the game. And watch how Caruana does this. Basically, Tari has no active plan here. So that rook is already threatening to come down here, so that's why the bishop dropped. And now the king comes up the board to support that pawn. So you can see black is now dominating the center, and white doesn't have a good response. Now it's time to just switch that rook round. So here we go, rook f7. Caruana taking his time here. He can afford to. He dominates the position. Rook f8, he's just making sure everything's fine first. And now rook b1 played. Basically, black can threaten to come in with a rook on the f or d file. So watch how this happens. Knight f5. So potentially a check here, and potentially the rook coming to d8 as well. So for example, yeah, rook e1, rook d8, like this. This is simply overwhelming with black's rook coming in here. So Tari decided to try to get some counterplay with b4, but Caruana actually just snuffs this out very easily. That knight switching round, so he's now targeting that weak pawn here. Has to be defended. Rook c8. Pawn takes pawn on a5. Pawn takes pawn c4. And knight b4. Well, you can see that as that pawn has advanced up the board, the d4 square is now available for black. So potentially the king has entry through d4. Yeah, king f2, king d4 is very good for black. Rook b1, king d4, here we go. And now knight d3. Well, black has just crept forward another couple of steps. There is really no way out for white. Rook c5, that just covers some pawns. And yeah, there's really nothing that white has at all. I mean, black is simply threatening to play king takes c4, and the e-pawn is going to advance. Tari took on d3, pawn takes. Well, that pawn edges a step closer to the queening square. And after rook e5, that's a good final move, cutting off white's king. And now black's king can support that d-pawn through to the queening square. Here Tari resigned. I think a really interesting strategic game from Caruana, and Tari was just, well, he was at sea really after that pawn sacrifice. So Caruana looks like he's on superb form. You can see the difference between a strong grandmaster and a top grandmaster in that game. Well, there's going to be more coming from Norway Chess soon. You can see I've got a slightly different backdrop at the moment. I'm away from home, away from my office, taking a little break. But I'll still be keeping you up to date with events from time to time. Thanks for watching.